a gal who was a member of our club, but she drove 107 miles from Waterford tonight to get here. So she has put out the special effort to be on our program. If you read your newsletter, you'll notice that she's very active in the Civil War service, being very on the board with the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable and the newsletter editor there, the general orders. And I want to thank Donna publicly. She always saves a seat for me at the Milwaukee meeting, so I appreciate that. She's also very active in the Prairieville Irregulars, which is a stepchild of the Civil War Institute at Carroll College, now Carroll University. So she's president of that group and is treasurer of the West Side Soldiers Association. So Donna has just a little bit of interest in the Civil War. And it's very my pleasure to introduce her tonight to talk to you about Varina Davis. Donna, you're on.
Thank you very much. And I'm really glad it was just a snow flurry on the way up here. A nice breezy little day. Well, as Dale said, I am a member of your organization, and I have been. I don't get up here very often anymore, but it's a pleasure to be with you tonight, a little bit before Thanksgiving. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about Varina Davis, the other First Lady during the Civil War. We always hear a lot about Mary, not necessarily so much about Varina. So I'm going to give you some background on her family, what happened when she met Jefferson Davis, and her life after Jefferson Davis passed. I got to tell you, going in here, Jefferson Davis was not such a great husband. Okay? He was kind of schmucky, to put it mildly, when you find out about him. Well, let's start out with Varina. I want to talk about Varina, not Jefferson. We'll talk a little bit about Jefferson, but the focus of my talk is about Varina. Her family was the Howells. They were very impulsive. They were a hard-driven Welsh family. And they left Wales in the early 18th century, and they settled in Delaware. And that's where Varina's grandfather, Richard, was born in 1754. Richard was one of many children born to Ebenezer and Mary Bond Howell. The family moved from there to Shiloh, New Jersey, where they purchased quite a bit of land. Ebenezer also owned a few slaves. He practiced law, and his son would also follow that profession. Both were supporters of the Patriot movement, and in the War of Independence, Richard would have quite a brilliant military career. He was dedicated to the cause. He endured the winter at Valley Forge, and he actually became quite a good friend of George Washington. Another brother died in the service, and his cousin, George Reed of Delaware, was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Post-war, Richard joined the Federalist Party, and in 1793 he was elected to the first of 4 terms as governor. He married a Quaker, Keziah Burr. She was the daughter of a prosperous landowner. She was literate at a time when many women weren't, and would be described by Varina as educated and refined. Richard and Keziah had 8 children, and William Burr Howell, Varina's father, was born in 1795. He had a good education. He'd leave home to join the Navy. Most of his brothers stayed in Jersey and in Pennsylvania. They prospered both in banking and law and in agriculture. And his sisters married into prominent families. And Varina would, through her life, carry on a correspondence with her northern or her Yankee cousins. And she was quite proud of her grandfather and her other kinfolk in the north. She had 34 first cousins in the north, most again, whom lived above the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, so if you look at it in parallel to Mary, Varina is down south with kinfolk in the north, and Mary is up in the north with kinfolk back in the south. Varina would describe herself as having a lot of family feeling and said that a large family is a treasure more valuable than any fortune. And she believed that kinfolk should assist each other, and she did that for her kinfolk for the rest of her life. Her father, William, served in the War of 1812, and after the War of 1812, he traveled down to Mississippi and decided to settle down in Natchez. So he was the southern part of the family. When he arrived there in 1815, it was a thriving settlement of about 2,000 people, and he found a position as a clerk in a mercantile back then. And he also, at that point in time, struck up a friendship with Joseph E. Davis, who was a lawyer, of course, from Kentucky. He owned land in the Mississippi Delta, and he had a brother named Jefferson. And 6 degrees of separation doesn't go very far sometimes when you see the connections. Joseph Davis himself did very well in his law practice, and he would grow very rich in the few years, while William Howell's fortunes went into a decline. Davis introduced Howell to the woman he would marry, Margaret Kempe, and Jefferson Davis would characterize the Kempes as a wild people. Not sure why he thought they were wild, but he thought that they were wild people. But then, when you look at Jefferson Davis and the way he led his life, I guess anybody that went out there and had a little fun would probably be considered wild. Margaret's father, James, was a Protestant Irishman whose family included barristers and landowners, and he also served in the Patriot Army. And he married Margaret Graham, said to be a beauty with a sharp wit. And in 1801, their daughter Margaret, one of 6 children, was born. In 1809, after James killed one of his in-laws in a duel over politics, that's when they moved to Natchez. And they lived there until his death, and they purchased a plantation named Marital. Both James and Margaret would emerge as community leaders. He would help gamblers out of the town center, help find a local orphan asylum. He fought in the Battle of New Orleans under the command of Andy Jackson and continued to prosper after the war. Margaret Kempe would pass away in 1818, and James followed in 1819. Margaret's share of the estate, now this is Margaret who married William, made her quite a wealthy woman. She inherited 60 slaves and more than 2,000 acres of land. She would marry William in 1823, and Joseph Davis stood in as their best man at that point in time. And in 1826, Varina was born. She had an olive complexion, which she inherited from her Welsh ancestors, and she was named for one of Margaret's friends. And the family lived in a house built by Margaret's family, which they called Kempton. In the early 1830s, that house was destroyed by fire, and the Howells moved to a new home in Natchez, which they called the Briars, named for, of course, the undergrowth around the area. And although the family lived there until 1850, William Howell never bought it. He rented that home for the entirety of their stay there. 11 children were born to the couple, 7 lived to adulthood. And that's a pretty good percentage for that point in time. Margaret would call her children her treasures. She loved books and passed on that love to her children. Her oldest daughter, Varina, was educated. The children would study piano. They learned French. Varina's brother went to Princeton, and the two would exchange letters actually in French. Varina was tutored by a gentleman named George Winchester. And Winchester was educated at Yale. He settled in Natchez as an attorney and then became a judge. He was a law professor in a firm of one of Margaret's brother-in-laws. And in 1830, or in the 1830s, he moved into the Briars, and the Howell children call him Uncle. And Varina would be his only pupil from the time she was a young girl until the time she married Jefferson Davis, which was quite an unusual arrangement for that time period, since most girls were not tutored at all. It was just the boys that were tutored. Varina would also attend, for a very brief period of time, a girls' academy in Philadelphia while her parents visited relatives in the area. She was quite a tomboy. She liked to roam around the Briars with her brothers. When Kempton caught fire in the 1830s, she actually ran inside the home and rescued 2 of her siblings from the fire. She had a lot of friends. She had beautiful large eyes and glossy hair, but was considered plain of feature, and her olive complexion and slender build did not fit the standards of that day, where in the Old South they favored that pale complexion, and a plump figure was considered quite attractive. I like that. Varina was deeply attached to her mother. She had 4 surviving brothers, 3 sisters died as babies, and a surviving girl was born in 1842. She was quite an affectionate sister. Her father suffered that financial collapse in the 1830s, and once he went through that financial collapse and his personal debts rose for him, he really pulled away from the family. And it came across that he really did not care for his children. Margaret, his wife, her brother actually bailed him out twice. Their goods were sold because of his death, and her brother actually bought the furnishings back and gave them back to the family. And he did that a couple of times, but he was always in and out of financial difficulties. And he then began to start using his wife's dowry to pay his debts. And he would try and scheme, and you know how it goes when you're in debt, you're trying to make ends meet that way. But Varina would always be haunted. From that period on, she would always be haunted by financial concerns. As the family fortunes decreased, Varina and her mother would take on more household responsibilities. Varina learned how to sew and cook. She was her mother's helper as the family increased. And her elder brother, after he left Princeton, did not go on in college. He began working as Jefferson Davis's overseer. And again, as I said, William Howell really pretty much withdrew from the family. Now, Varina's aunt also went through a quite lurid divorce at that period of time, which would also leave Varina scarred and always in fear of a public scandal, which would also kind of direct how she led her life and her relationship with Jefferson Davis. She feared scandal. She would not let any scandal touch her. And it showed in the fact that she stayed in her marriage. After Varina married, though, her mother advised her to control her emotions, do her duty to God and her husband as she had learned to do. In December of 1843, Varina received an invitation from her father's friend, Joseph Davis, who lived about 70 miles away, and she went and stayed with Joseph Davis's daughter. Her tutor accompanied her to the location, and then he left. And that was in about Christmas of 43. When she arrived in Winchester, Winchester returned to Natchez and left her in the care of Joe Davis's daughter. Now, we know Jefferson Davis, he was 12 years older than Varina, okay? Normally in that period of time, you saw marriages happening between people who were 6 or 7. She was 17 when she met him. Okay, so there was quite a big age difference between that. I'm sure you all know a little bit of that history of Jefferson Davis. You know that he was married once before, then he married Sarah Taylor, Zachary Taylor's daughter, and she died 3 months after they were married. And he grieved for her for over 8 years. So this invitation that Joe brought in was kind of to bring a woman into the picture in hopes that he could connect her with Jefferson and maybe get him out of these doldrums and have him remarry and go on with his life. Now, Varina met Jefferson Davis when she was issued an invitation to Joseph's plantation, which occurred shortly after she went to stay with his daughter. So she came to the hurricane, and I'm going to tell you what she wrote to her mother. This is her first impression of Jefferson Davis. She wrote, "Today, Uncle Joe sent by his youngest brother. Did you know he had one? An urgent invitation to me to go at once to the hurricane. I do not know whether this Mr. Jefferson Davis is young or old. He looks both at times, but I believe he is old, for from what I hear, he is only 2 years younger than you," his poor mother. "He impresses me as a remarkable kind of man, but of uncertain temper, and has a way of taking for granted that everybody agrees with him when he expresses opinion, which offends me." Do you think that carried on to his presidency? I think so. "Yet he is most agreeable and has a peculiarly sweet voice and a winning manner of asserting himself. The fact is, he is the kind of person I should expect to rescue one from a mad dog at any risk, but to insist upon a stoical indifference to the fright afterward. I do not think I shall ever like him as I do his brother Joe. Would you believe he is refined and cultivated, and yet he is a Democrat?" Well, okay. So, Varina fell in love with Jefferson Davis. Here's a 17-year-old girl. She's quite impressed, in an unreasoning way, as she recalled. Davis, on his part, was ready to fall in love again and was attracted to her high spirits and affectionate nature. He called her gifted. The romance moved quickly, and the couple had agreed to marry by the time Varina returned home in February of the following year. Now, her mother had reservations about the match. The age difference was there for them. And it was clear that they didn't think alike. Varina was a Whig, he was a Democrat. Varina thought Jefferson's politics kept him on the road too much. She did not want to live in Briarfield or Hurricane, preferring Natchez. She found it hard to confide in him, although he encouraged her, but also admitted he was prone to censuring her sometimes. George Winchester, her tutor, approved the match, and William Howell, probably again due to the financial concerns, he was pleased with the match. She was entering into a prominent, financially secure family, and Margaret allowed her doubts to subside, and they agreed to the marriage. On February 26th of 1845, the couple were married at the Briars as Varina and her siblings looked on. No one from Jefferson Davis's family was present at the wedding. That included Joe, the brother. The couple went to New Orleans for their honeymoon, and then they stopped in Locust Grove, where, of course, Jefferson Davis took Varina to visit his wife's grave. Kind of a strange way to spend the honeymoon. Varina was gracious about the first Mrs. Davis, but according to her great-granddaughter, she worried about being compared constantly to sainted Sarah. The start of their marriage was good. They read together, they visited friends, they took long walks. Davis seemed to be quite an indulgent husband, yet he already seemed intent on subduing her personality, writing to her mother that her daughter was growing calmer every day, as he wished. She was naive about her duties as a plantation mistress. She expressed surprise that the slaves required so much of her time, and at that time Davis owned about 74 adult slaves. Much of the responsibility for feeding, clothing, and the medical care of the slaves fell to Varina. She cooked occasionally, she knitted frequently, she mended her own clothes. She also made clothing for her siblings and sent them home. She sent food packages to her family back home. 7 years would pass before she would bear her first surviving child. There were miscarriages, most likely in 1847 and 1848. Hints of difficulties began to appear between Varina and her in-laws. She gradually began to see just how different most of her in-laws were from her own family, and they were very self-contained people. She would comment, "The first year of married life is difficult for two people born with a different strain of blood, educated differently, and compelled to make constant compromises of temper and mode of life." She began to wish that the Davises would stop visiting and that they had more privacy at their home. Jefferson Davis's political career also presented problems for the couple. After the state Democratic Party nominated him as their congressional candidate in 1845, he left immediately to campaign, and he won in November of that year. She worried that she'd never acquired the fortitude necessary to be a politician's wife and to bear his long absences. But the nation's capital was quite exciting for the young couple. They arrived there in December of 1845. They moved into a boarding house on Pennsylvania Avenue along with other Democratic couples. Varina gave up her Whig loyalties and became a Democrat, like her husband. Their time in Washington, though, became brief. The U.S. went to war with Mexico in 1846. Davis had promised her he would not volunteer for the Army, changed his mind, and joined, and Varina, once again alone, returned to Mississippi. While he was in the Army, Varina became embroiled in a struggle with Joe Davis. She was under the impression that Joe actually gave her, before her marriage, that Briarfield was Jefferson's, and it wasn't. Joseph had not given the title of the land to Jefferson, and after that argument with Joe, she would distrust him for the rest of her life. She hoped that her husband would be supportive of her in this mission of title, but no, Jefferson didn't back her up. He backed up his brother's actions instead. So she felt doubly betrayed at this point in time. She felt betrayed by Joe Davis, and she felt betrayed by her husband. She and Jefferson quarreled before he returned to the Army, and he was on furlough, and the quarrel would continue over the mail. He informed his wife that he stopped into New Orleans to see and visit several female acquaintances he had known while he was in the Army. She spent New Year's Eve in 1847 all by herself. After a visit from her mother and her siblings in February of 47, she returned to Natchez for about 5 months, and a new issue for the couple to fight about occurred. Who would live at Briarfield? Because now Joe Davis wanted his widowed sister and 7 children to move in with them. And of course, Varina opposed this. Jefferson Davis tried to mediate it unsuccessfully. And Varina would also discover at that point in time that Joe had some illegitimate children that he had failed to disclose, and described him now as a libertine. And the gossip about offspring probably prevented Joe Davis from the one going into politics. In 1847, she found out also that Jefferson Davis had written a will indicating that he chose to leave Briarfield and a share of the income from the property to his wife for her lifetime only, and did not allow her to decide how to dispose of the property upon her death, leaving it instead to Joseph. She was angry that she would not own Briarfield after her husband's death and blamed Joseph for depriving her of her legal rights. In 1847, Davis would return to Mississippi, and in August of that year, he was appointed to a vacant seat in the Senate, so he left Briarfield once again in November without Varina, which would become truly a pattern during their entire marriage. She felt restless. She hated the monotony of plantation life. She expected Davis to contact her in a few weeks for inviting her to join him, and he didn't. The inheritance issue came up again, and anger letters were exchanged between the couple. And Jefferson Davis said he would not return to Mississippi until he was sure she had changed for the better. And she wrote a couple of 2 more angry letters that spring. All right, so it's funny. I'm going to just stop for a moment here. When I was first researching Varina Davis, I ran into a site online called Romance Ever After, blah, 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 okay? And this woman wrote this thing on Varina Davis and this, beautiful little marriage and how everybody was always happy and it was just like a dream come true and a fairy tale. And I'm reading it and I thought, boy, you missed some of the stuff that was going on in that family big time, Well, in April of 1848, Davis responded to her letters indicating that her habits, her education, and her combativeness made her challenge him, and he could not bear that. He knew that she did not wish to drive him to temporary stupefaction, meaning drink, or vicious associations, which is another way of saying that he chooses not to go in to visit some ladies of, shall we say, looser morals. But he might have to resort to those of her behaviors if she did not stop with the angry letters. In fact, he continued, he wasn't even sure if they could live together anymore. He expected her to abide by his wishes, which he said was demanded by her by duties as his wife. So he did not view his marriage as a partnership. And I think this is also a reflection when you look at the Davis presidency on how he was with his subordinates. It was the same way. Do not challenge me. Do not challenge me. The summer of 1848 did not see any improvements in the relations between the two. He came home in the summer during the congressional recess, but left for Washington in November, once again leaving Varina behind. Did she consider divorce? No, probably not. It was hard to live in the South. And remember, her Aunt Jane went through that terrible divorce and that stigma, and it reminded her about that. She remembered that, and in her old age, she would write that marriage was a lifetime contract and that all Southern women considered divorce a disgrace. So she thought about it, but she knew she would never act upon it. So Varina gave in. Her only choice, she felt, was to, if she wanted to remain married, is to give in to Jefferson Davis. She confided to her mother that she would keep silent on the miserable subject of her conflict with Joseph and accept her husband's decrees. The quarrel had lasted 3 years. In 1849, she wrote Davis, calling herself a thoughtless, dependent wife. For a woman to read this is hard. In the summer of 1849, he finally came back to Briarfield, and Varina made a conscious effort to subordinate herself to Davis. In December of 1849, she was finally allowed to return to Washington with her husband, finally escaping the plantation at last for the city. So what about that time in Washington? She loved it. She was happier, she blended in easily with the social life, the marriage seemed happier at that point in time. She acquired more expensive clothes at that point in time, which befitted her station there. She was proud of his political presence, but didn't always agree with his approach, finding it too fierce for my taste at times. Jefferson Davis himself disliked political women who brought up political topics and tried to discuss them. Varina continued to help her family during that time, who in 1850 had left Natchez for a fresh start in New Orleans. She made clothes again for her family, and she sent cash set aside for her own allowance. In September of 1850, congressional session done, Davises went home to Mississippi, where once again he almost immediately left for several weeks on a speaking tour. Varina spent the time furnishing a new 8-room house on the grounds of Briarfield. And in November of 1850, Davis returned to Washington alone. Varina was pregnant. In December alone, she miscarried. Davis finally returned to her in March of 1851, 3 months later. But in May and June, he left again for another speaking tour. In 1851, he loses the race for governor, and Varina at this point is relieved. She felt she lacked the ability to be a governor's wife, and I think she probably hoped that he'd stay home for a while. Well, they settled down in Briarfield from September of 1851 to March of 1853. So for 19 months, she was mistress of Briarfield. And that was the longest continuous residence she would have at that plantation. In 1851, in December, she was pregnant again with a baby due in July, and she asked Davis to stay close, but he left in June and July for speaking tours. And their son Samuel was born in July. In 1852, Franklin Pierce was elected president, and Davis was recruited as Secretary of War, and in spring of '53, he once again returned to Washington. And as a cabinet officer's wife, she had demanding social obligations, which she once again enjoyed. She was expected to entertain frequently and elaborately, which she did, and she became quite the renowned hostess and mastered Washington etiquette at that point in time. In the spring of '54, their son Samuel came down with measles, and he would die in July, a few weeks shy of his second birthday. In February of 1855, her daughter Margaret, who they would call Maggie, was born, named after Varina's daughter, Varina's mother, and all the Davis children would share her olive complexion. So, down at Washington, in 1857, Varina would have another child very quickly, Jefferson Jr. She developed childbed fever, and she actually lay close to death for several weeks from that. She did return to her duties as hostess, and she did enjoy playing the occasional practical joke. One of them on General Winfield Scott, who she thought was pretty darn grandiose for himself. At a dinner party, he disparaged the soup that was served, and Varina politely told him that it was prepared by his own chef, who she had hired for the occasion. In April '59, she had another son named Joseph. And then, of course, we had Lincoln being elected in 1860, where Davis resigns after 61. Varina wasn't convinced that secession was the way to go, and after the assault on Fort Sumter, she tried really hard to become a Confederate patriot. When the government moved from Montgomery to Richmond, she packed up again, maintaining a good front. But she confided her true feelings to her mother. She said the constant attention placed on her was exhausting, and again, she expressed her doubts on the South's ability to wage a war. The region was not ready for a fight, she said. She told her mother that she had made up her mind to come here and be happy no matter what danger there was, and run with the rest if need come to that. Richmond society didn't quite really accept her. She was the Confederate First Lady, but she encountered a lot of pressure to conform once again. People paid a lot of attention to her looks. She was considered handsome. One politician called her a good-looking lady with plenty of flesh and blood. Her eyes, of course, were dark and arresting, and probably her best feature. And she spent a lot of time on her hair. She spent an hour just doing her hair. She employed her own seamstress, and she favored rich fabrics. But her complexion was not considered the right color by Richmond society. One person actually referred to her as a mulatto. Pretty damning for that period of time in the South. She was taller than most women of her generation. She stood somewhere between 5'6" and 5'7". She did not talk like a first lady. She was blunt. She was too well-read. She was too smart. Her sense of humor could get her into trouble. She was a good mimic, but she could choose the wrong person at the wrong time to mimic. So in Richmond, for the first time in her life, some referred to her as crude. She did not fully support the cause. That went against her. She sent letters to friends she had made in the North. She had kinfolk in the North, and that was questionable and dangerous behavior on her part. And I think we can all remember that Mary Todd, Lincoln went through the same thing. Another son, William, was born to her in '61, and when her husband was inaugurated, she left immediately after the swearing-in, which again was not politically correct and was not forgotten by Richmond society. She was friends with Mary Chestnut, and they did have their differences, including how loyal they were to the cause. I think we all know and have read Mary Chestnut enough to know that Mary was very loyal to the Confederacy. But they, in spite of their differences, they did become fast friends. Early in the war, she would frequently visit Union prisoners at the Catholic Hospital in Richmond, bringing them supplies. And she was criticized again for that, and they felt for insufficiently visiting Confederate hospitals. So sometime after 1862, she just stopped. She ceased all visitations. In the spring of 1864, their 5-year-old son Joseph fell off a balcony at their residence and died. And Varina had earlier left the mansion to have lunch with her husband. So you see that they have their tragedies with their children kind of mirror the other half of our Civil War couples. In June of 1864, their last child, Winnie, was born. Now, at the end of the war, Davis blamed her for his capture. Now, when everybody was packing up, Varina packed up her children and met up with Davis. When he was recognized, though, a soldier aimed a gun at him and she threw herself in front of him. And Davis said he would have escaped if it wasn't for her standing in front of him. Lots of gratitude there. All right, by mid-August of 1865, though, she was able to correspond with her imprisoned husband, and for the first time, she began to manage the family's finances. Briarfield had, during the war, of course, been confiscated by the government, and the efforts of Varina and other people led to Davis's release in 1867. The couple, after his release, and while waiting to see if he would be tried, spent time in Canada, in Lennoxville, Montreal, among other expatriates and ex-slaves. They moved to Great Britain after that to try and resuscitate his finances. They sailed from Quebec in 1868, and Varina looked forward to starting a new section of their life. The aristocracy in Britain embraced the Davises. They visited Paris, but decided not to live there. Back in England, she saw very little of Davis. He was always on the go, and any hope that she might have entertained for a companionable marriage at that point in time, which he had promised her in his letters to her from prison, didn't materialize. In 1869, his attempts at establishing a commission house evaporated. Davis became bored with England, and he missed the South. So he went home. But he went home without her and the kids. He left them in England to fare for themselves. She had to figure out how they were going to live, where they were going to live, and what they were going to use for money, because he left them nothing. He went home. Abandoned once again. He took a job with an insurance company and wrote to her indicating that she needed to make a decision on her own residence. Davis still saw himself as a public figure, and he thought that Varina might have forgotten that. Now he settled in Memphis. And then there was a lady named Virginia Clay that Davis became entangled with. In 1870, Davis is still in Memphis, Varina is in London, and Davis was having an ongoing correspondence with Virginia Clay, whose husband had passed away. Eventually, she would marry someone else, and he would write her a letter telling her that she was his beloved. Well, in the summer of 1870, he now comes back to London, and the family packs up and moves back to the States. In 1871, there's a train incident. Davis is on a train from Memphis to the University of the South in Tennessee, and the Louisville Commercial broke a story that he had a sexual encounter on the train with a woman who was not his wife.
No.
All right. So now where do they settle? They settle in Beauvoir, which is owned by Sarah Dorsey, who gives it over to Jefferson Davis. Okay. He visited the estate on the Mississippi coast in December of 1876. And if any of you remember from Hurricane Katrina, it was damaged during the hurricane. It has been restored, but there was severe damage, I think, done to the main level of the porch area there. In 1877, Davis decides he's going to write his book there, so they move into there. Sarah became ill in 1879 and willed the home to Davis. In the 1880s, the marriage between Varina and Jefferson reached pretty much an armistice. The finances had improved by that point in time because now they had income coming in from the Dorsey properties that Sarah had willed Davis. Their daughter, Winnie, was educated in Europe, and she was very devoted to both parents. She was engaged for a while to a gentleman named Alfred Wilkinson, Jr. He was a Yankee, a Northerner, and there were some questionable things in his background. There was some many allegations that were made, and they weren't sure whether they were affecting him or his family, his father and his father's brothers, but there was still that stigma. Well, Varina, at that point in time too, she knew that Davis didn't love her as much as perhaps she loved him. In 1889, she said as much to one of her neighbors, a William Morgan. In a letter to Morgan, she indicated that she didn't like the idea of Morgan's daughter Belle marrying a widower. She said a young woman should not marry a burnt-out vessel. She's blunt, isn't she? She would also write, I gave the best in all of my life to a girdled tree. Her husband was a live oak, good for any purpose except for blossom and fruit. And she wished nothing more than for Belle to have the love, the whole love of a man's heart. So I think that's a pretty telling remark on her marriage too. But Davis still would be the center of Varina's life. Remember, she didn't believe in divorce. She had her duties as a wife. He was her chief responsibility and her chief patient. He suffered from mysterious fevers. He had incapacitating headaches. His weight would end up dropping to 140 pounds. And she explained to one person, a friend of hers, she said, I must, as you know, stay where duty calls me. So by this point in time, it is a duty. Now, Davis dies in 1889. He contracted a cold, which would turn worse and would set him down on a downhill course. He would die finally from acute bronchitis. His daughter Winnie was in Paris at the time, and their other daughter Margaret was on her way to New Orleans when she received the news. Briarfield was left to Varina by Davis, but upon her passing was left to her two daughters, and Varina had no say in that disposition. So once again, Davis thwarted her with her being allowed to make that decision on her own. Beauvoir was given to Winnie, and most of the rest of the estate was given to the daughter Maggie. In need of finances, Varina turned at the suggestion of several in the South to writing a book about Jefferson Davis. The book was over 1,000 pages long, the memoir on Davis, and it was completed and appeared in print in the fall of 1890. And Varina, at that point in time, hoped that she could live off the sales of the book and live her life that way. Well, the book is completed. She then decided where she needed to live. She didn't want to live at Beauvoir. She still considered that Sarah Dorsey's estate. And the house was filled with Dorsey's property. The dishes on the table were Sarah's. The dressings on the bed were Sarah's. Everything was Sarah's. And there were also strangers that kept showing up unannounced at Davis's last home. And it was burglarized while she was away once, so she didn't feel safe there. She didn't want to stay at Briarfield. It was hot and swampy. She didn't feel she could make a living as a planter there. She also ruled out Colorado, which is where her daughter Maggie and her family lived at that point in time, citing the high altitude as unhealthy. So, in 1890, she made a trip to New York to visit her publishers, and that's where she decided to stay. She moved into New York with her daughter Winnie. She would tell Maggie, her daughter, that she was free, brown, and 64, and could do as she wished. So she's finally letting that inner self free. She liked New York. She thought the rent was fairly cheap there. There were several thousand white Southerners that moved there after 1865, and it appealed to her imagination. She would reside in the city for 16 years, her longest place of residence since her girlhood in Natchez. She stayed there. Varina and Winnie would live in several large apartment hotels in the New York area. It's now where the theater district is in New York. They would eventually settle at 123 West 44th Street at the Girard Hotel, and she liked to sit in the window and watch the city go by. For the most part, the Northern Society welcomed Varina and Winnie, and she, by this time in her life, had developed rheumatism, so she walked many times with the aid of a cane or even the use of a wheelchair. But other than occasional chest pains, she felt that her health was good. She had gained a substantial amount of weight. She was a very tall, thin woman when she was young. And in pictures where she's older, it looks like she's about 40, 50 pounds overweight in those pictures. She is quite a round little lady. But she considered the weight gain a healthy issue. She thought that was what kept her alive this long. the wig that she had put on. She dressed well. She was always dressed well in very tailored attire. She always dressed in black. Her income was about $1,000 a year. She didn't have a pension, and she realized that she couldn't live on the proceeds of that memoir she wrote, so she decided she would continue to write for a living. And eventually she came to an arrangement with Joseph Pulitzer, who became a good friend of hers, he and his wife, at the New York World. And Pulitzer paid her an annual stipend of $1,200. And she communicated directly with him about the types of articles that she would write. She also wrote several book reviews, too. She remained a public figure, and the white Southerners really expected a lot from her. She would call herself Varina Jefferson Davis, or Varina Jefferson Davis. And she never considered marrying again. She joined all the expected organizations from the South. The United Daughters of the Confederacy named her their honorary president general. But she would not allow her name or Winnie's name to be used for any kind of fundraising without permission, and she never ever gave up her northern family and friends. And she would not leave New York. The South expected her to live and die in Dixie as much as Mrs. Robert E. Lee and Mrs. Stonewall Jackson did, and she didn't. One Birmingham paper really criticized Varina and Winnie severely for abandoning the South, and the New York Times came to her rescue and defense and stated that she had the right to live wherever she wanted to. She met Julia Grant, and they became good friends. She actually wrote quite a very nice article on Ulysses Grant, which probably killed them in the South, that President Davis's widow would write kindly about Ulysses S. Grant. In 1898, Varina and Winnie spent the summer at Narragansett Pier in Rhode Island, and in July, Winnie went to Atlanta on Varina's behalf. Varina was sick, to give a talk to a group, and she rode through in a carriage, in an open carriage in a downpour, and became quite ill after that. So she returned to Rhode Island ill. She was diagnosed with gastritis and was expected to recover, but she really deteriorated. And Winnie died on September 18th at the age of 33. So Varina had one daughter left, and that was Maggie, living in Colorado. In 1905, Varina's health starts to fail. She had trouble with her eyesight by that time and began to lose feeling in her extremities. And in October 1906, at the age of 80, she returned from a holiday in the Adirondacks, and she caught a cold. And that turned into pneumonia. And she had already by that time outlived all but one of her children. She had one sister, Margaret, who still survived. And Varina would die on October 16th of 1906. And that happened to be the anniversary of the deaths of two of her sons. William died in 1872 on that date, and Jeff died in 1878 on the same thing. In her last hour, she talked about the war, but no one thought to record what she had to say. She was buried in the family plot at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond on October 19th. And her tombstone inscription, which for all supposition was probably decided upon by her daughter Maggie, simply said, "At peace." So in conclusion, I think she was really quite a remarkable woman for her time. I think she was really ahead of her time. I find it interesting that really neither of our presidents at that point in time, Lincoln or Davis, really had happy marriages. You know, there was, but for different reasons. I think Varina she's such an intelligent woman, she's such a smart woman, and given a different period of time, it would have been totally different for her. But she had to really bury her own personality for a long, long time, and do her wifely duty to Davis in order to sustain her marriage, because she steered away from that scandal. She knew what the scandal was. She saw what happened to her father when their finances went south, and her father distanced himself from the children. Her children and her family were always important to her, always uppermost in her mind. And she never forgot that, and she always was dedicated to them. So, I think she made quite a remarkable First Lady. And I thank you for your attention. foreign country and say, hey, figure out where you're gonna live, figure out what you're gonna do for food and money. Unconscionable.
So she wore black the rest of her life?
Yes, she
Mary
did.
just like Mary.
Just like Mary did, yes, she wore black. Dale?
I lost track of how many children she had.
They had, see, there were the boy that died, there was carriages, I think there were 5 living birds, the 2 daughters and the 3 boys. Yes?
When did Maggie die?
Maggie, I don't have the date of her death, but she outlived her mother. That I do not have. There is a picture in one book of the 4 generations where you see Varina and her great-granddaughter, her granddaughter, and her daughter in the picture. It's quite a charming picture. But I don't know Maggie's date of birth, death rather.
The book that Varina wrote, is that still out there?
I'm assuming, yeah, it probably is in the archive somewhere that you can get it. They also asked, she was also approached to write her own memoirs. Not his, but her own memoirs, and she did not, she declined, would not do that.
Were you able to, did you read her book at all?
No, that I could not get my hands on. But I will tell you that I read what she wrote in the memoir, and it was, she defended him. She was a good wife. You know, she defended him, she supported him. She explained a lot of his, actions and that, so she was very kind to him in the book. And I don't think we could expect her to do anything but that. You know, considering how she led her life, she wouldn't turn around after he was dead and disgrace him in any way. Yes?
Just as a comment, probably not really much of a question unless it came across. But Brian was a North Carolina 4th Infantry, was a colonel of that regiment, and he once said when my relative Stephen Dotson Ramsey was promoted to Brigadier General of that regiment, that it was all because my relative was once cordial to Jefferson Davis's wife. Probably at the time when she was socializing in Washington, he was there also prior to the war, socializing.
Yeah. And she fit in quite nicely there, contrary to when Mary was with Lincoln and he pretty much wanted to send her home. She really fit into the Washington lifestyle. She liked the, etiquette-wise, she was fine. She did the entertaining as a hostess, so she really fit into that quite well. The 2 first ladies, you sit there and say, I admire her quite a lot. I do.
When Jefferson Davis got arrested until the time he was released from prison, how was she supported?
Well, they still had the family estate. Well, they didn't have the family estate, but they still had the Davis family there, which helped with the support at that period of time. And remember, she was the wife of the then being held ex-president of the Confederacy. So there were funds coming in from Southerners also that helped sustain her.
How did she support herself when she was left in England with her children?
There isn't a whole lot of information on that regard. I think she gave some talks that would also generate money. She also made friends there that helped her out financially while she was overseas by herself. But it was quite a controlled lifestyle. She didn't have a lot, but it was enough to sustain her. She was a proud woman, but she did get assistance because she was able to make some friends over there too.
Why did that lady give Jefferson Davis, or will Jefferson Davis, her estate?
She had a thing for him. Power attracts, as the old adage goes. And Virginia Clay, the gal I mentioned earlier, he felt that she was his kind of lost love, that was the woman he should have married because she agreed with him politically on all fronts and that. And Sarah Dorsey ran into him when he was doing his speeches through the South and that, and became quite attracted to him and wanted to support him. It was part of the Confederacy too. She felt that he needed to have a home.